Hello and welcome to the Better Man Clinics, the podcast where we talk to actual experts to address the questions that men want answered, but are either too embarrassed to ask or simply don't know who to ask. Before we get started, I do want to caution that the conversations on this podcast are for informational purposes only. They don't represent a medical consultation, nor do they present medical advice to individuals. Rather, we hope that the podcast empowers men with the knowledge and confidence to address these issues with their healthcare providers. As with any medical or wellness issues, you should always consult with your healthcare provider before beginning any type of treatment or preventative intervention. With that being said, in this episode, we discuss sexual anxiety. Now, most guys can remember an anxiety-provoking sexual experience. Sexual anxiety often occurs with a new partner and is caused by thoughts like, what will they think of my body? Or will I be able to perform? Or how long will I be able to last? Or will I be able to get them to an orgasm? For most guys, these thoughts are fleeting, but for others, they can persist and lead to a bad sexual experience. And these bad experiences can lead to more anxiety, creating a vicious cycle that can destroy a man's sex life and his relationships. So how can men recognize when sexual anxiety is becoming a real problem? What can they try to overcome it? And when is it time to seek help from a specialist? Fortunately, to help us answer these questions, we are joined by Dr. Emily Jamia, a licensed marriage and family therapist, licensed professional counselor, and a certified sex therapist. Dr. Jamia has over a decade of experience working as a sex and relationship therapist. In addition to maintaining a busy private practice, Dr. Jamia offers online workshops as part of her mission to make her knowledge accessible to everyone. She speaks nationally and internationally to a diverse range of audiences, including educators, health and mental health professionals, and the general public. Her expertise has been featured on CNN, USA Today, NBC, CBS, and magazines such as Men's Fitness, Self, and Women's Health. Dr. Jamia is also a proud ambassador to healthywomen.org. Her academic research focuses on how to create optimal relationships and sexual experiences. And now, without further ado, I bring you our conversation with Dr. Emily Jamia about sexual anxiety. Hello, and welcome to the Better Man Clinics. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that is near and dear to a lot of guys' hearts, but one that they feel very uncomfortable talking about, and that is sexual performance anxiety. We've all shared stories about it, mostly lighthearted. We've seen TV shows that reference it and movies where a guy might be in a new situation, maybe with a new partner, and sexual activity is possible and the anxiety creeps in. Questions might occur like, what does my partner think of the way I look? Will I be able to perform adequately? Will I be able to satisfy my partner? And for most guys, this anxiety kind of dissipates away and they can have a pleasurable experience, but for some guys, it doesn't. And it can lead to a bad sexual experience or multiple bad sexual experience and really put them down a spiral, which can truly ruin their sex lives. So with that being said, what can we do about it? How do we even recognize it? Well, fortunately, today we are joined by a true expert to help us sift through this issue. Dr. Emily Jamia is a licensed or certified sex therapist. She's also a licensed professional counselor, and she actually has a doctorate or a PhD in the field of sexology or sex therapy. Dr. Jamia, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and join this important conversation.
Absolutely. And it is truly important because this is one topic where definitely guys truly don't know where to turn to. I can assure you that if a guy goes to their primary care physician and talks about sexual performance anxiety, they would get a inquisitive look like, why are you asking me these questions? And
Right.
I have not a clue how to help you. So we really hope that we can shed some light. Before we dive into the topic, I always love to have the guys that are listening or viewing this to get a better understanding of the expert they're hearing from. So, Dr. Jamia, one thing I'd love to hear from you is what inspired you to go into the field of sex therapy and really help a lot of these guys and couples get through these hurdles associated with sexual activity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, my dad is a physician. He's an OBGYN, and I grew up in kind of a small town in Tennessee. And before I even realized it, I was the one that my friends started coming to for questions about sex, because within my own family, we were very open, and my parents, I felt like gave me a great sex education. It was something I felt comfortable talking about, but most of my peers in that small town in Tennessee did not have the same experience.
Sure.
And so I think I was a sex therapist really from a very early age, because people would come to me and be like, hey, can you ask your dad about this? And I'd be like, yeah, sure. And, I'd go to him and come back with answers. And so I think it kind of started there. It was just something I always felt comfortable talking about. And then fast forward, I was studying psychology at the University of Texas, and I knew I wanted to go into that field, and I also knew I wanted to specialize in something, except at that time I wasn't really sure what. So I was taking a few psychology electives, and then I took the human sexuality elective, and I was just hooked. I think that it was an interesting topic, as it is for a lot of people, but I realized that sex is so intertwined with our psychology. I think that by asking questions about someone's sexuality, you learn so much about who they are as a person. It's obviously such an important part of relationships. And so at that point, I started focusing my studies in that specialty. And I think that by the time I finally graduated UT, I had taken every human sexuality class that they offered, and the rest is history.
That's fascinating, and I'm sure it's pretty rewarding, because I know that when people reach you, I'm sure that they've kind of at wit's end, because there's very few that can help them.
Yeah. And, a lot of them have tried like talking to their marriage therapist about this. And unfortunately, and it still really baffles me, sexology is not something that's taught in many degree programs for marriage and family therapists, despite the fact that it's such an important part of marriage and all relationships. And so a lot of people come in very frustrated, at their wits' end. They've talked to their physician, they've talked to their other therapist, and they're just desperate for help. And I'm a marriage and family therapist as well. And so, a lot of what I do, it is the overlap. There's marriage therapy, relationship counseling, individual therapy, and then of course, whatever's going on with them sexually, we talk about that.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of couples that seek marriage and family therapy and are happy to talk about their relationship problems, but sex has kind of becomes a taboo topic for a lot of people, and they don't feel comfortable even bringing it up. And
Right.
that's, as we talked about, that's really one of the reasons why we have this podcast, is to not be afraid or shy away from those difficult discussions that people are very embarrassed about, and they don't need to be, and we really want to destigmatize that for them.
Right.
So,
Right.
with that being said, I gave a stumbling and bumbling introduction about sexual performance anxiety.
Mhm.
But as a professional in this field, how would you define sexual performance anxiety in men if somebody came to you and described their problem?
Well, the first thing I would do is strike out that word performance, and we can just call it sexual anxiety. We don't realize how meaningful language is, and how much weight words hold that we use to describe ourselves and our bodies and our situations. My clients are not allowed to use the word performance from the first session. If they come in using that word, they get a little slap on the wrist, and you should see the vocabulary that they leave therapy with. It's very different. But a performance is something usually you buy tickets to go see, and you are passively watching while someone is up on a stage, right?
Right.
Who wants to feel that way during a sexual experience? No
Right.
one. So I prefer to refer to it just generally as sexual anxiety, or if we're talking specifically about erection, they're allowed to say things like, erectile dissatisfaction, or erection difficulty, or difficulty with orgasm. I'm really not even a huge fan of the word dysfunction, because that just feels really pathological to me. And so the first thing I do is lighten the language around it. And truthfully, that lighter language is typically a better fit for what they're experiencing. Very few people who come into my office have, true erectile dysfunction as it's described in the DSM, which is what we use to give people clinical diagnoses. So that's the way I like to talk about it.
Well, that's so huge, and I didn't consider it obviously in using it, in the sense that, again, if you're already setting themselves up for failure in some way, because they're already starting to judge themselves. Again, when you throw performance, there's a judgment there, right? Do you get an A, a B, a C? How did you do, right?
Was it good or bad?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And if and that has to do with whether it's erections or whatever you name it. But like you said, if you think about this is just an experience, right? And I'm having anxiety about an experience, not about performing. I can be afraid of heights, not about climbing the building. So it's interesting. And that's actually an interesting way to think about it. I think that probably is halfway there already in terms of just framing it in their minds. But I'm probably getting ahead of myself. So the next question I have for you is, in medicine, we have profiles, right? So some people come with a problem. You imagine it's a so-and-so year old male, and maybe he's a certain weight or race, or maybe he's married or not married. Is there a certain profile of a guy that has sexual anxiety, or is it really across the board?
As far as the people I see in my practice, I would say there's a really wide variety of people who experience sexual anxiety. I see younger people in their 20s who have it. I see people, throughout really every life stage who are struggling with it. And we have to, take the research with a grain of salt, because when you look at the studies about what percentage of men experience difficulty or loss of an erection at some point, there's such a wide difference in numbers. I mean, the numbers that you see from studies that came out pre-Viagra are very different than the numbers in studies that came out post-Viagra. And I think part of that is because before we had that medication, it's still stigmatized today, but it was even more stigmatized back then. Now, at least people talk about it a little bit more because you see the commercials, or you see like low T centers popping up all over the place. And so I think people feel a little bit more comfortable talking about it, but it's still not something guys are really excited to admit that they have a problem with. But I can tell you from what I see in my clinical practice that I see young, middle, and old, and really people in every life stage.
And so one question that brings up in my mind, so I can imagine, well, it doesn't matter age, but a guy in a new relationship, anxiety I can see how that can come into play, right? It's a new partner. What will they think of me, et cetera, et cetera. But do you see sexual anxiety in people who, let's say, have been, because you brought up the example of marriage and family therapists. So people who've been married, who've obviously had sexual activity together before, this is not new to them. Do you see sexual anxiety in that situation? And if so, what triggers that anxiety for some, given the fact they've already gone through that process?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It can happen kind of in one of a few different ways. So for one group of people in the very beginning of a relationship, everything is very, very intense, sex feels very spontaneous, it feels effortless, all is good, they don't have any problems. Well, once that neurochemical high comes down and that intensity transitions into intimacy, that's when sometimes guys start experiencing issues, because suddenly there's more vulnerability, there's more closeness, it doesn't feel as easy and effortless. So I see that happen typically around like the 6 to 18 month mark of a relationship is when that transition occurs. But then, yes, I also see people who may have issues at the beginning of a relationship because it's all new and, a little bit anxiety provoking. They don't know their partner's body or what they really like. And so there's a little bit of spectatoring that happens, and they may experience it a bit temporarily, but then it gets better. But then I also see people who've been married for several years, 20 years, 30 years, who never really had an issue. And then there can be a triggering event. Maybe it is something health related. So I always have them go get checked out just to see if there's any, cardiovascular issue, diabetes, those sorts of things. And I'm sure you can speak to that more, that may contribute to ED. But oftentimes it's kind of a mini trauma that they experience, maybe loss of a job, and now their self-esteem is suffering, or they have a hard time tuning out the baby that they know is in the other room, or they're trying to get pregnant and suddenly they have like 3 days to make that happen. And that can provoke anxiety. So there's a number of reasons that the loss of an erection or the inability to get an erection may happen. And so part of what I do as a therapist is put my detective hat on and I ask about everything so that I can get a better understanding of what's happening. Or a lot of times it's relationship conflict. People don't realize that the health of the relationship is correlated to how comfortable we feel sexually. And so if there is, problems in the relationship, or, in some more extreme cases, let's say there's been an affair that they're trying to recover from, all of those things can affect how we function sexually.
But that's interesting. So it sounds like there's kind of a bifurcation there, right? So like or maybe it's an overlap, but at a beginning of a relationship, it's all about me and kind of what will my partner think about me, et cetera. And later on, it might be either third extraneous issues that are kind of ruining things, or maybe you're starting to worry because the old you is not the new you, and maybe you are having some physical problems that now you really are worried about performance.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, and generally speaking, most guys notice that, typically in their 40s, sometimes it might feel a little bit more challenging to get an erection. They have to put a little more work into it. And people who don't know that can suddenly freak out that there's something wrong with them. And then that's when the anxiety develops, like, why am I not getting an erection as easily as I used to? But what I like to tell people is that's not a bad thing. I do a lot of research with couples who feel like they've sustained really high levels of sexual satisfaction over the course of long-term monogamous relationships. And when I ask them to describe some of the best sexual experiences they've had, they don't talk about the sex that they were having in the honeymoon stage. They talk about the sex that they're having later on in their relationship, when they have to be a little more intentional about it and work together. But that's not what people are taught. That's not what we see in movies. And so a lot of guys don't know that and can go into panic mode when that happens.
That's a really interesting point, because one would imagine that, again, when you're as a couple overcoming an issue, it'll bring you closer. But guys approach this more from an ego situation where, like, oh man, I'm not bringing the right things to the table, if you will.
Right.
And so I'm letting my partner down. But it's so interesting to see the different perspectives, right, from that, where it could actually be a better experience, where it's just not, as they say, if you have to work hard for something, you tend to appreciate it more.
Exactly. There you go.
Easily, right? I'm with you. Now, we've talked a lot about erectile dysfunction as the cornerstone of this, but I've heard a lot of other issues that guys worry about that can cause this anxiety aside from erection in terms of the experience. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So I'm sorry. Can you repeat that question?
Sure, absolutely.
So is this all editable?
Not a problem at all.
Okay.
So we've taught folks a lot on erectile dysfunction as a source of anxiety. Will I get an erection? Will I not get an erection? But there's other issues that guys worry about. They worry about, what will the partner think of my appearance? Or, will I ejaculate too soon? Will I satisfy them? Can you speak about that kind of spectrum of concerns that guys face that may cause them the anxiety around sexual activity?
Sure. So there are a lot of reasons why anyone might experience sexual anxiety. You mentioned some, like body image, worrying that they're not satisfying their partner, concern over how long they last in bed. Are they climaxing too quickly? Do they feel like they're taking too long to climax? So, there's a lot of things that may cause someone to feel a little bit anxious during a sexual encounter. And a lot of times there's overlap between the two. So like, I might have a client come in, let's say, complaining about premature ejaculation. And when I start asking questions, I find that he's also struggled to maintain his erection. And so what happens is as soon as he gets that erection, he tries to have an orgasm really quickly before the erection goes away. And now he's developed premature ejaculation. So I always am assessing whether what they're coming in with is a primary issue or if it's secondary to some other problem that they're having. And definitely, just like women may be concerned about body image, guys can have body image concerns as well, about their body as a whole, as it changes with time, as inevitably happens for most people. Guys can have concern about the size of their penis. I actually would say I see that a little bit less often than I do just more general body image, but it is a concern for a lot of people. Sometimes even their partners can put a lot of pressure and anxiety on them. So we've thus far talked about the expectation that guys put on themselves to quote unquote perform sexually. But what a lot of people don't realize is women or, partners can put a lot of pressure on. I mean, I've worked with many, many couples over the years where I have to really work with the partner on being a, teammate at the end of the day, because they have significantly contributed to the problem lasting, whether it's their reaction. A lot of times I think this is interesting when I ask my clients, whatever they're coming in with, let's say it's problem with the erection or premature ejaculation or whatever. And I'm going through a time when that happened with them. And I ask them, what was the worst part of that experience for you? And a lot of them say the look on my partner's face, or the fact that my partner started crying, or the fact that my partner accused me of not desiring her, or, those are the kinds of things they say. So partners play a huge role in the sustenance of anxiety. And I think that's important to talk about as well.
Which is a big problem, because guys tend to internalize so much of this, and if you don't feel comfortable talking with the partner, and I'm assuming that is exacerbated when the partner is crying at the end of that sexual activity, right? That doesn't help the situation. Now,
Definitely.
a lot of what you talked about, in my mind, whether it's from the standpoint of the guy or the partner, it all comes down to expectations. And the question of where they get those expectations from. Now, I heard a statistic from another podcast I listened to that said that we are, as a society, having less sex than we've ever had historically, and we've replaced that with porn, right? So our partner becomes OnlyFans or Pornhub or whatever.
Yeah.
And you obviously are talking to people every day, and I know you do research as well. To what extent has pornography and kind of the mainstreaming of pornography really changed and shifted expectations and led to this increased anxiety?
Yeah, I think that's really important to talk about. So porn has had a really big impact in a lot of negative ways, for some people, in some positive ways, and we can talk about both. I, for one, am not like totally anti-porn. I think it's something that can be enjoyed in a healthy way, but I do also work with a lot of people for whom I feel that porn has had a more significant negative impact. You mentioned expectations, so we can start with that.
Yeah,
definitely. Porn is the last place you should be getting your expectations about what to do sexually. That is not the bar that you want to strive for. A lot of times couples are positioned in a way that is best for the camera angle and not in a way that is pleasure focused. You don't see couples communicating about likes and dislikes or preferences. Obviously a lot of porn that we see involves, heterosexual couples, women in particular, in more of a degrading position. There's often a power exchange at play. That kind of thing is not what most couples enjoy. But for someone who doesn't know that, or that's where they've gotten their sex education, they can come into a sexual experience thinking that that's how it's supposed to go. You, in porn, a lot of times you see women having orgasms within a minute or so, or multiple orgasms, or at the same time. You see that in Hollywood too. You don't see couples struggle over how to come back from sexual mishaps that might happen. You don't see the cleanup. I mean, you just don't see any of that stuff in porn. And so, and we're looking at a select population that maybe has much larger than average penises and is not representative of the average size of most people. You're seeing typically porn that's very focused on intercourse and not other kinds of sex acts. So there is just, I could go on and on. There's just so much in porn that is not realistic for most couples. And that's really important. And I would say one of the strongest negative effects I see in my practice from porn is delayed ejaculation or inability to climax and with their partners in real life. And I think that is due in large part because if you think about when maybe you're clicking around the internet on porn, you might be keeping yourself in a really high state of arousal for a long period of time as you're, watching several videos or looking at several images. And it's not until you decide to tune back into your body to then bring yourself to climax. And it's just so different when you're with an actual partner. So there's the keeping yourself in that high state of arousal for a long time. And there's also just, obviously the images that you see in porn are going to be far more intense than what you would experience with a typical partner. And then also there's not the emotional element, porn obviously is very one-sided. So you're very tuned out from your body versus when you're with a partner, you want to tune back in and obviously be considerate of whether or not they're having a good time. So it's just totally different animals and the sexual response can be very different. And so I think people don't realize how much they might be conditioning their bodies to respond to something that isn't going to happen in their real life.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So the question then becomes, I don't know if there's an answer for it. How do these guys get realistic expectations? Where do they get these realistic expectations from?
Yeah, so I try to start with a lot of psychosexual education. There are even some DVDs sometimes that a lot of people don't have DVD players anymore, but there used to be this set of DVD players set that I would recommend people watch, and it's real couples having sex. They talk about what they're doing. They talk about why they're doing it. You see them sexually communicating. So just so people can see if they're visual and that's how they've learned, it's like a good stepping stone in the right direction. And then really, if they're in a relationship, I work with both of them on setting realistic expectations. Sometimes I'll give people, I have like this long handout that has all kinds of things you can think of that you might do sexually, and they put, a check mark if it's something they aren't currently doing, but they're interested in trying, if it's something they'd like more of, if it's something they might be willing to try, if it's something they definitely don't want to do, just to get people more comfortable talking about their likes and dislikes and preferences. And then a lot of times, especially if someone feels like they're kind of conditioned to respond only to porn, I will say to cut it out for a period of time and begin just by self-pleasuring without the use of porn so they can learn to tune back into their body and strengthen the awareness of their arousal. And so I do things like that to help people overcome it.
Yeah, it's a good way to approach it for sure. One problem that guys have is self-awareness or lack thereof. They may feel anxiety, but they may not, put two and two together, understand what's causing it, and they start going down a vicious cycle and a rabbit hole very quickly. How can guys recognize that they're having specific sexual anxiety? Are there cues that they can hone into to kind of recognize that this is their problem?
I think the biggest cue or clue to that you might be experiencing sexual anxiety is whether or not you notice that you're spectatoring during a sexual encounter. So that's a term that clinicians use a lot to describe the feeling like you're kind of watching yourself as a third person. It's almost an out-of-body experience. You're sort of kind of judging whether you're doing something the right way or not. So you're kind of keeping score in one part of your brain rather than being fully present in the moment. And so if people are experiencing that, then that's a good sign that then, or bad sign that they might be experiencing sexual anxiety. And then there's the more obvious signs. If they're starting to dread sex, if they're feeling worried about what's going to happen or how the next sexual experience is going to go, if they notice their heart rate is picking up, then all of those are signs that they might be having anxiety.
I'm just having that image of like, I can just see in a movie, like, right, they're having sexual activity, and then they tune in like where he's like a gymnast, and there's like the Bulgarian judge with giving him a
Yep.
score for costume and stuff. I can just totally
Yes.
see all that coming. But
Exactly.
it actually makes a lot of sense, because you're definitely not in the moment if you're out there judging yourself, saying, oh,
Right.
did this wrong, oh, what are they thinking about that?
Yeah.
For sure. Now, you actually led in with, in terms of kind of some of the consequences. We talked about, it can actually make, erectile dysfunction worse. Can you talk about, in your practice, kind of like where this anxiety has led guys in terms of their sexual experience?
I would say it leads people to even more sexual dysfunction or sexual difficulty, because, it may start off that they have a little bit of anxiety about one thing happening, but then they develop what's called anticipatory anxiety, that they're anticipating that they're going to feel anxious, which then makes it snowball, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that, if they're feeling that, they are definitely going to have anxiety and most likely experience some kind of sexual difficulty. And so I would say that's usually what ends up happening, especially, and here's something I want people to know. I can say with almost 100% certainty that almost 100% of guys are going to lose their erection or be unable to get an erection at some point, but a lot of people just don't know that. And I feel like it needs to be a public service announcement, because I think if people knew that, then they wouldn't worry about it so much. Maybe it's because you're just distracted, that you've got something going on at work, or you're a little fatigued, or you had one too many drinks. There's just a lot of everyday reasons that may cause someone to be unable to get an erection. But I think a lot of guys buy into this myth that they should be able to get a firm erection regardless of the situation, regardless of the partner, regardless of the circumstance. And when that doesn't happen, oh my God, there's something wrong with me now. I have ED,
Right.
But it just happens. It's normal for it to happen. And so I think if people knew that, we would see a lower prevalence of sexual dysfunction in men. Women, on the other hand, I think realize earlier on that there's a little bit more variability in what happens, during their sexual response. But that's not the case for men.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Again, it goes back down to expectations. If for you having one experience where you have a poor erection is basically the end, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy
Right.
at that point, basically. So, it sounds like, obviously you can start having a lot of problems: erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation, failure to climax, sexual avoidance, as you expressed, and then obviously it leads to relationship issues, which can further sexual anxiety. So again, just doing an internet search, I came across a few tips that are recommended guys even before they see a therapist, right? Like, oh, try this at home. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on some.
Okay.
One was what they're just calling distraction, right? So put on some music or do something that gets you out of your own head. Have you found that to work?
So I guess it depends on, I don't like the word distraction, because definitely I wouldn't encourage, like, let's say someone's trying to make themselves last longer by thinking of something really unsexual, or, they're unfortunate looking ant or something like that. No, I would not advise that. But I would encourage people to do things that might help them relax and set the mood. And so if listening to music is one of those things, if just saying, hey, to your partner, can we start off just by you like kind of caressing my body or giving me a little massage or something like that, so that I can make that transition from the noise that's in my head all day long into focusing on my body and focusing on you. I think that's great advice. But generally, I wouldn't encourage anyone to do something that is going to, quote unquote, distract them from the experience. Because what we're always trying to do is strengthen that mind-body connection and get people to feel fully present and embodied in the experience.
Got it. So going over baseball statistics in your head, probably not the
Not a
best
good
solution.
tip. And it's kind of a band-aid, so you hear tips like that mostly when people are struggling with premature ejaculation, right?
Sure.
Just think of something else. But it's usually a band-aid. It's not a good long-term solution. There are lots of things people can do to help build arousal awareness and, elongate the sexual experience while staying fully present and connected to their body.
Got it. So a distraction that will relax you, but not take you away from the experience, which makes sense. Now, another thing you mentioned was about, caressing or massage. Another thing I came across in terms of a tip for guys is focus, again, to your point, focus away from the performance. So try other things that don't require you necessarily to perform, whether it's caressing, whether it's masturbation, whether it's anything that doesn't actually require the act of physical intercourse. What are your thoughts on that?
Great advice. Love that. Definitely. I can give that advice 2 thumbs up. It's really important, I think, to have a wide variety of the things that are on your sexual menu. Like I use a restaurant analogy a lot. Let's say typically you go to your favorite restaurant and you always get the filet, but one night you go and they're out of the filet. Are you going to leave your favorite restaurant? Probably not. You'll take another look at the menu and see what else sounds good and hopefully still have a great time. And I think the same principle applies to sex. There are so many things that we can do. I believe it's Peggy Kleinplatz in one of her books says, the good news is that sexual function is not necessary for great sex. The bad news is that sexual function is not sufficient for great sex. So it is a piece of the puzzle, but it is not the whole shebang. Right. And truthfully, one of my favorite populations to work with are men who have had, maybe prostate cancer and they've had radiation or prostatectomy, and they have like a physical reason why they can no longer get an erection the same way. And they come in very understandably distraught about that. And I ask them, what do you miss most about the sex that you used to have? And 9.5 out of 10, they will say, I just miss the connection I felt with my partner. I miss the closeness. Not once has someone said, I miss my rock hard erection. Not once. And so the point is, without even realizing it, they're valuing the feeling that they had of a sexual experience and not the what was happening physically specifically. And so, yes, definitely, I would say do like outer course play or activity until, you feel more comfortable. One of the most tried and true techniques is one called Sensate Focus, where you have couples essentially take turns giving each other what starts off as almost like a sensual massage, but you don't touch any genitals the first time you do it. And it's just to help relax the body and get back in touch with the body. And then you gradually progress, and maybe genital touch is included, but there is no focus on getting an erection. There is no focus on having an orgasm. You want to move away from what we refer to as goal-oriented sex. If you're having goal-oriented sex, you're setting yourself up to feel disappointed. And so I think that speaks to what you found online. And I would say that's good advice.
And that makes sense to me. So the natural question that I know guys would ask me if this would be coming boom right next is, okay, this sounds great. Okay, it'll calm me down. I'll get rid of the anxiety. How do I transition to actual purposeful sex, right? How do I know? Because then I'm going to get anxious just thinking about now I have to transition, right? Like, how do we make that natural transition from this anxiety reducing experience to now, okay, you got to perform sooner or later. How do we jump into that?
So what I would say is sex does not begin with an erection. Sex does not end with the male orgasm. Okay. So what may happen is, let's say they're feeling pretty comfortable with the things that they're doing, and now they're ready to try intercourse, and they get a little bit of anxiety. What they do is back off from intercourse again and go back to doing the things that they're comfortable with and maintain a sense of openness to the very likely probability really, that the erection will come back. I think what happens to a lot of guys is they feel like if an erection is lost, it's lost forever. And that's actually people who know that, no, it can come right back, will start to just hang out and kind of wait for it to happen and, enjoy other things in the meantime. One exercise I'll give to guys oftentimes is just during masturbation to go ahead and intentionally let the erection subside and then work to bring it back, and then let it subside and, try to bring it back. And that helps build their confidence that they do have more control over it than what they might think.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So you're basically changing, I mean, not to put words in your mouth, you're changing it from a goal-oriented start to finish, here's where we start, here's where we finish, to a more fluid experience that is more open-ended, and it can transition from one back to the other, which really takes all the stress out of it. Because again, if you're noticing things are starting to fade, okay, back off. And as long as but I'm assuming the partner has to be a willing participant there and understanding of what's going on, correct?
Yes, they need to be on board with this. And this is where I used to, like, people would come in saying that I want to come into therapy because I have ED. And I used to say, okay. And they'd say, I want to come to see you and I don't want my partner to come in. And I'd say, okay, we'll do a couple sessions. I don't do that anymore, actually. So if they are in like a serious relationship, I pretty much tell them, no, we might have some individual sessions down the line, but I need your partner involved from day one. Otherwise, you need to know that your prognosis goes down significantly. So having a collaborative, cooperative, understanding partner is absolutely essential. I tell people it's like you're in a three-legged race. If one of you stumbles, you're not going to get back up and finish the race until that, you work with each other to get back up. And so that's super, super important. I'm glad you bring that up.
So I'm going to ask you a difficult question then. In an ideal world, with you 100%. I personally talk to guys who this has ruined their relationship. They're currently not in a relationship, and now they are intimidated to get into a relationship. And they're seeing the doctor because I need Viagra, I need this, I need that, because they think that's going to solve all their problems, including their income taxes. But and unfortunately, we have to break the news that it doesn't. What do you say to guys like that who are, I don't have a partner, and I'm worried to get one because I think this is going to happen all over again. And I certainly don't want to go into a relationship saying, by the way, we just went on our first date. Let me tell you what my therapist tells me and where we have to go with it.
Yeah.
Right? What would you tell a guy like that?
So of the individual clients that come in to see me, I would say the vast majority are men who are in between relationships, just as like you described, where they had issues in their last relationship, it caused problems. The first thing I would say is, you don't want to be with a partner long-term who is going to let something like this ruin the relationship. Like, that's just a sign you're going to have you're going to have issues problem solving, probably about a lot of things, and that they're just not a very good teammate. They may lack empathy or understanding. They may be closed-minded and not open to learning new ways of connecting. So that's just a sign that that probably wasn't the best relationship for you. And so what I do is, a lot of the therapy, as much as we can, similar techniques that I've been talking about. There's a lot you can do individually just with self-pleasure and masturbation and cutting down porn and tuning into your body and becoming generally more sensual and developing an awareness of likes and dislikes and those sorts of things. And then I help them fine tune their radar when picking a partner, and so no, they don't have to say from the first date, I've been in sex therapy and this is why, and this is what my therapist said, but I help them kind of figure out earlier on whether or not the person that they're starting to spend time with is someone who is hopefully more likely to be collaborative with them, who's a little more open-minded, who has, more fluid expectations. And then once they start a sexual relationship with them, I encourage them to go slow. And if issues come up, I coach them on how to talk to their partner about what's going on and, how they might get their partner on board to help with them. And so, yes, there's still plenty to do, I think, for people who are in between relationships.
That actually leads to a question. So this would require, if you're getting into a relationship, this is going to require a conversation, right? Because I would imagine that you as a guy, let's say you have all these techniques guys learn from you and they take it into a new relationship. the partner may not be expecting that. The partner may be expecting that goal-oriented experience, right? Where, okay, the partner may be nervous too and say, okay, let's get this done. You know what I mean?
Right.
Let's get through it. So I'm assuming that there are conversations that need to be had so that they're both going into that first experience saying, this is not going to be a goal-oriented experience. We're going to take it slow. And are you okay with that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. And I mean, truthfully, the earlier on in a relationship you can talk about sex, the better off you are long term. Because I tell people, look, the sex you had in the very beginning of the relationship is going to be different than you have when maybe you're trying to get pregnant, or there's a baby in the other room, or you've got, kids, you're running around to activities and you're both working and you're exhausted, or when you're empty nesters, or when someone injures their knee and your favorite position is no longer an option. I mean, there's just so many things that can happen.
Right.
And so what I talk a lot about, and I have like a whole section dedicated to this in my online course, is adaptability and how important it is to be adaptable to the ever-changing circumstances and to have a partner who you can work with on that. And so I really do think the earlier on those conversations happen, the better off you are.
Got it. One thing, as you know, guys are very nervous about seeking help for anything, particularly this. So they don't want to go get their regular health checkup, much less talk about sex, at least not with other guys, but with a professional. So one thing I like to do on the podcast, I like to demystify that experience for them. So if I'm a guy, whether I'm with a partner or without a partner, and I call Revive Therapy and I say, you know what, I think it's time. I tried the other things. I think it's time to get help. What am I going to expect in that first consultation with a therapist like you? What should I expect from that?
So I think the first thing, people are so nervous when they first come in. And I think the biggest surprise for a lot of my clients is that they end up feeling a lot more comfortable more quickly than they think they will. And I don't know if that's just my mad skills or if it's just, most therapists know that talking about sex can be anxiety provoking, and we know how to help you feel more relaxed and comfortable and create a safe environment. So I think if you can just get over that little hump, then you'll feel better about the process as a whole. And then usually what we do is ask you a lot of questions about the issue itself, when it started, how it started, what your, response was. Has it gotten worse? Are there times when it's better? What's been your partner's involvement? And so we just ask a lot about what's going on currently. And then it's usually helpful to get a little history, just so we have a baseline, like how were you 10 years ago, 5 years ago? Some therapists, and this just depends on theoretical orientation, will ask some questions about like your history, like, and it's important. I ask those questions. I think it's important because I have people who maybe this is coming from like a low self-esteem place. And if maybe they grew up in a household where they were made to feel not good enough their whole lives, even though they may be pretty high functioning in other areas of their life, sex is just a space where like those demons can come back out. And so it is helpful to know, just, did you experience any abuse or trauma, or, what was going on, so that I have an understanding of how they feel about themselves overall. I tell people that your sexuality is like a fingerprint. It is different in some way, shape, or form than anyone else's sexuality. So it's important that I know everything that's might be contributing to your sexuality. And then we talk about what the goals are. I don't have a magic wand, but realistically, what are your hopes and expectations? I may help them adjust some of those expectations, and then we work together to hopefully attain those goals.
And like you said, that if they do have a partner, you strongly recommend or even require them to bring them with. And do you, if for those in that scenario where the guy has a partner, do you interview them together or separately, or how does that usually work?
So I prefer to have the first session jointly. Just I get a lot of information from watching the relationship dynamic, hearing both sides of the story, Because a lot of times people have totally different versions of the truth. And
Yes.
so that's very helpful for me. And really from the first session, so that we can mutually talk about the goals. What are your goals as a couple? Because sometimes one person has this set of goals, another person has a different set of goals. And so I work with them on meeting in the middle. And then I'll schedule individual sessions so that we can dive a little bit deeper. And my policy is if there are things they want to talk about in that individual session that maybe they don't feel comfortable talking about with their partner, that they can do so. Because, sex is sensitive. And sometimes there are thoughts or feelings we have that perhaps we're trying to shield our partner from, or we don't really want them to know how upset we might be with something. And so they can talk about that. And then usually we reconvene to then start some intervention, hopefully at that point.
So with intervention, I'm in no way going to simplify, because it sounds, like this is very nuanced, and it really is. It's not like let's beat every nail with the same hammer. That being said, I just want to clarify a few things, because again, if you go online, if you go on Dr. Google and you type in, which I did because I'm not a genius, type in, sexual anxiety, a few type of therapies pop up. And what I'd love to do is just to hear from you, like what those mean, and maybe if they fall into what you're talking about, or if they're completely different. One of them that came up in terms of therapeutic approaches was cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. What is that, and how does that fall into sexual anxiety, or the treatment of sexual anxiety, I should say?
Yeah. So the idea here is that our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors are all linked. So let's say you're having anxiety. Okay. That's the feeling that is connected to the thought, I am not going to satisfy my partner, which leads to the behavior of avoiding sex. Okay. What we try to do is work with people on coming up with more balanced thoughts or alternative thoughts, because that's usually the easiest one to work with off the bat. And then seeing if the alternative thought lessens the feeling or hopefully changes the behavior and through that, we start changing it. So let's say you have anxiety, rather than thinking, I'm not going to be able to satisfy my partner, a great alternative thought might be, this might be an opportunity to find a new way of satisfying each other, which then hopefully might lead to the behavior of initiating a sexual interaction with open expectation or without expectation. Right. Which then lessens the anxiety, because now you've had a new positive experience. And so that's a very simplified example of how we might approach things using the CBT model.
And so basically, if I'm understanding correctly, it's kind of a little bit of mindset shifting, right? So
totally,
like we talked about at the very beginning of the discussion, which we talked about, don't say performance, because that already sets a mindset. So just by doing that, you've already shifted their mindset. This is not an opportunity for you to perform. This is an experience for you to enjoy, etc. So it's just kind of shifting that mindset going in is what cognitive behavioral therapy is, basically.
Yeah. Right? Yep, definitely.
Next one, well, that clears it up for me. I got it. So next one, not that I could do it, but I got it. The next one is guided imagery. What is that?
Yeah, so guided imagery is a great way to use parts of our brain that are always accessible to us, but we somehow seem to forget about them, I think, during sex. Just like an athlete might spend time kind of meditating on what it might like to, let's say, hit a hole in one, or, hit a home run, or get a jump shot. They might spend time kind of imagining what that's like. There's actually research that shows a link between people who do that, who essentially kind of meditate on positive outcomes of an experience. The actual sensory areas of the brain will light up as if they are being activated in real life. And so it's a neat way to, I think, just kind of focus on what it would be like to feel different. And then what often might end up happening is that you do feel different. So I think of it almost as like a meditation. And I have a meditation for sexual anxiety on my website. So if anyone wants to check that out, that's essentially what it is. It's like I think it's like a 3-part meditation, focusing on sexual confidence. And then I have one specifically for, erectile dysfunction. I have one on rapid ejaculation. And so it's just about getting back into the body and using some of our higher order thinking skills, because animals can't use mental imagery the way humans can, to hopefully make some real results.
Well, that's really interesting. So it's kind of, I think athletes call it pre-gaming. I remember when Michael Phelps won the Olympics, they interviewed him and he said he would, like, before every swim, he would literally in his mind go through that whole, every stroke from beginning to end. So in the sexual context, you had said like parts of the brain kind of light up. Is it a question like you're almost fooling your brain in the sense that you're saying you've already done it successfully, and so that gives you the confidence to do it in reality? Is that kind of what the process is doing?
Exactly. Now, I want to specify, I have not read studies that looked at this specifically about sex, but there is some research to suggest that athletes can do this exactly to the outcome you just described, or people who are healing from an injury, who, like, they took two groups of people who tore their ACLs, and one group did physical therapy only, the other group did physical therapy and mental imagery, and they found that that group actually healed faster than the control group. And so, yeah, I mean, there is something that's happening that's actually making changes in the body. I also think it's a great way to just relax. How much time do we spend just tuning out the world and tuning into our bodies? Not much. And so it's like a meditation.
No, that actually makes a ton of sense. It really does. That connection, also the analogy to sports makes a lot of sense, because there you are performing, but you are, but at the same time you're adjusting. The last one that came up, and I think you addressed before, is couples therapy, but I'm assuming that's what you were discussing in terms of getting them together and becoming a team. Or I don't want to simplify it though.
Yeah, so it may just be that, hey, we got to get both of you on board. And I always reframe it as thinking this is not a he or she issue or a you or them issue. This is a couple issue. One of you is just maybe exhibiting the symptoms. And so that's kind of a systemic way of thinking about it. And so sometimes it's just a matter of getting them on board. Other times we identify some serious relationship conflict or distress that is probably contributing to the sexual issues that they're having. And so we're doing more intense therapy with the couple and addressing what that conflict is. Maybe there's long-term resentments they haven't really, processed. And so, the therapy for couples can look very different.
Makes sense. When or does medication come into the therapeutic regimen for sexual anxiety?
Yeah, so I do like to have them evaluated, ideally by a urologist who has some background in sexual medicine, because not all urologists do, but most have a little bit. And so they can check out whether it's like a testosterone issue or a blood flow issue or whatever. And so obviously if they identify something, then that needs to be treated, pharmaceutically, or maybe some adjustment to another medication they're taking needs to be made. The interesting thing though, and maybe you can speak to this as well. What I see oftentimes is people will get a prescription for something like Cialis or Viagra, and they're taking it, but they're not getting results because it's kind of like a mind over matter issue at that point, and they don't realize how context can overpower a physical response. And so even though the medication they think theoretically should be doing its job, the anxiety overwhelms that. So I do see that for some people, and in them, we just have to keep tackling it from a therapeutic perspective. Other times people do find that some medication can be helpful, and it's just enough to get them over the hump and build their confidence back up. And that can be beneficial. Other people find that it helps, but then worry about coming back off it because now they have sort of a psychological dependence on it. But, it's one of those things. I think it's an option. There's usually no harm in trying it, but if, let's say, you've been checked out by your doctor and they can't find anything wrong with you and they think it's psychogenic, I would say, let's just try therapy first before we bring a medication in it. If you still feel like you're not making progress, let's try it for a little while and see if it makes a difference.
Now, what about the guy that'll come to you and say, Dr. Jamia, well, I have sexual anxiety, shouldn't you put me on anxiety medication to take care of it?
Oh, I wish it were that easy because as you know, so many of the medications that are prescribed for things like anxiety or depression have sexual side effects.
Right.
And so it's like, oh, it's such a double-edged sword. The biggest, probably one of the most common class of medications that people are put on is a class called SSRIs. These are things like Zoloft, Prozac, Lexapro, and they're great at helping, anxiety, but oftentimes they can make it hard to have an orgasm. They can, put a dent in libido a little bit. Some people find that taking something just in the moment, like a very small dose of Xanax, can help take the edge off, but that's a muscle relaxer, and muscle tonicity is usually important during a sexual experience. And so sometimes you have to work with your doctor on finding just the right dose or combination of medications that can help with the anxiety. But unfortunately, a lot of them do have sexual side effects, some more so than others, but yeah.
Especially in this situation, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what kind of expectations should guys have in terms of how long the process would take, like from that first consultation? I mean, obviously there's no magic number here, but in terms of getting to a better state, and of course it means what that better state is, but if you had to give them an idea, how long does that process of counseling and therapy take?
I like to tell people, I like to err on the conservative side and tell people to plan for like 6 to 8 sessions. But I have a lot of people who come in and find that they make great progress in just a few sessions. I've actually moved to doing more intensive style therapy for people. So we'll meet for like a 4-hour period and hopefully like knock a bunch of stuff out. And then maybe they come back for like one follow-up session. And so it really varies. There are obviously other people who, the issue they're experiencing, we identify as because of like longer term trauma or something like that, that might take a little bit longer. If there's like really a lot of ongoing relationship conflict, that might take a little longer. But let's say for the average couple who do pretty well, but this is an issue that has come up for them, then, I think 6 to 8 sessions is a fair ballpark.
And, this is not a binary type of situation where, you have a heart attack, you fix the heart attack. How do you define success coming out of a treatment regimen?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There are a lot of tools to measure sexual satisfaction. I think it can be really helpful to give people a little assessment before and then at the end of therapy. And a lot of those assessments have some questions about, are you satisfied with your sexual function or your erection, this or that? But there's a lot of other questions on there just about how you feel about the sexual experience overall. And I think success really I like to assess just how they're feeling about themselves and their sexual experience overall, because let's say they were getting erections 0% of the time, and now they're getting them 90%. I have a client right now, actually, I'm working with, that this is kind of what happened. They weren't getting erections at all. Now they're getting erections, but there's other stuff that's going on that's still contributing to low feelings of sexual dissatisfaction. And it just got to the point where like, we just need to do more couples therapy. Like there's just so much happening in the relationship. So it really is variable. And really, I think what it comes down to is generally how you feel about the sexual experience overall and how you feel in your relationship overall.
And do you feel that most guys will get some level of benefit from therapy, or are there just guys that just doesn't really work?
I mean, I can't save them all. I wish I could, but yeah, there may be some people where, it takes more of a combination of like pharmaceutical intervention, medical intervention, therapeutic intervention. I would say that's less often the case. I would say the vast majority of guys get some benefit from therapy. At least my clients do. But every now and then there's one that comes through that Yeah, it might be
You
a
can't win
tougher
them all,
nut to
right?
crack.
That's for sure. That's for
You
sure.
know.
Dr. Jamia, thank you so much. This has been really helpful. Certainly, I've learned a lot. I'm sure the guys listening have as well. I'm going to leave you with a question I ask all our experts. This is called the Better Man Clinics for a reason. We all try to get better every day. And, in talking to experts, as an expert, you've obviously reached a significant level of success in your life. What's your secret sauce? What's the secret to your success?
Definitely think having a growth mindset. And I am very lucky to have a partner who I feel like has my back and I have his back. Like we just support each other in everything. And we are always finding ways to self-actualize and find that our relationship helps us do that. And so, yeah, I would say my mindset and my partner are two key elements.
Great advice in terms of how to do that. I mean, I found most successful people, they do have that support, that's for sure, and the right state of mind, of course. Thank you again. Really enjoyed the conversation. And to all you guys out there listening and watching, thank you for joining us. And remember our mantra here at Better Man Clinics: your best life is a journey and not a destination. And use every single day to get just a little bit better. We'll see you next time.